5. That's how many separate steward investigations have landed on Lewis Hamilton's file this season, before Formula One has even gotten through the Dutch Grand Prix weekend. And every single time, the explanation from the stewards has sounded almost identical. Let's lay out the file itself in order, because the pattern only becomes visible when you stop treating each incident as its own isolated story. Monaco. Hamilton is handed a 5-second penalty for exceeding the pit lane speed limit, not by a lot, a margin so small that when 3, 4, then 5 other drivers were penalized for the exact same infringement across the same event, it became clear something structural was going on with how tight the limit was being enforced that weekend. Silverstone comes next. A penalty for a minor movement under yellow flag conditions, Article B5.11.1 of the FIA regulations, the kind of technical breach that sounds abstract until you realize it cost him his podium position. Then Hungary. 3-place grid penalty for impeding Oscar Piastri in Q3, a call that turned what could have been Hamilton's first Ferrari pole position into a 5th-place start. Then Spa, a 5-second penalty for being ruled primarily at fault in a first-lap collision with George Russell, on top of a separate investigation into an unsafe pit release that saw a mechanic clipped and Ferrari fined €30,000. And in between all of that, Canada, where Hamilton was investigated twice in a single weekend, once for leaving the track during the sprint, once for impeding Pierre Gasly in qualifying, and walked away clean both times. That's the file. 5 investigations, 4 penalties, 2 clean verdicts, all in one season. If you're watching this from outside the usual paddock hotspots, tell us your country in the comments, because we want to know how far a story about stewards' documents actually travels. Here's the interrogation this pattern deserves because a single penalty is a driver mistake. A file this long is something else entirely. Question 1. Is Hamilton genuinely making more errors than the rest of the grid? Or is he simply under more scrutiny because every incident involving a 7-time champion gets a second and third look that a midfield driver's mistake never receives? Question 2. Why does almost every steward explanation in this file lean on the exact same phrase, that the stewards reviewed telemetry, positioning data, and team radio, as if the process itself needs repeating to justify each verdict? Question 3. If 4 of these 5 investigations ended in a penalty, and only 2 ended clean, is that a coincidence of bad luck? Or is it the kind of ratio that starts looking like a target once you write it down? Let's actually be honest about the case for scrutiny, because it deserves airtime before anything else. Former F1 designer Gary Anderson, reviewing Hamilton's recent run of incidents, didn't reach for conspiracy. He said plainly that he was surprised to see a driver with Hamilton's experience making repeated errors, and specifically argued that the Ferrari driver was largely responsible for both Hungary incidents. That's a technical voice, not a tabloid one, and it deserves to sit in this video on equal footing with everything else. Some of this file is genuinely Hamilton's own doing, but here's what that explanation doesn't fully account for. Look at the shape of the season around this file. Hamilton claimed his first Ferrari win in Barcelona in June. He added 5 more podium finishes after that. He came within 12 thousandths of a second of a Ferrari pole position at the Hungaroring, beaten only by Lando Norris on the final flying lap. This isn't a driver in decline making sloppy mistakes out of frustration. This is a driver having arguably his best statistical season since rejoining a front-running team. And the penalty file is growing at the exact same time as the results are improving. Those two trends don't usually move together. Now let's use the caso espelio this file actually deserves, because comparison is where credibility lives, not indignation. Take the Canadian Grand Prix specifically, because it's the cleanest side-by-side comparison available. In that same sprint session where Hamilton was investigated for leaving the track and rejoining ahead of Piastri, Audi's Nico Hülkenberg was penalized 10 seconds for the same category of offense against Liam Lawson. The stewards explicitly addressed the difference in their own verdict, writing that Hamilton's incident differed because Piastri wasn't in an overtaking position on him at the time. That's not proof of bias. That's actually the stewards showing their work, transparently, in a way that resolved the comparison rather than deepening it. When the system explains itself clearly, that's worth acknowledging just as loudly as when it doesn't. Compare that to Monaco, where the explanation gets murkier. Hamilton's pit lane infringement measured a margin so small it barely registered, and yet penalty guidelines treated it identically to violations several times larger, because the rule doesn't currently scale by margin. 3, 4, 5 drivers hit with the same penalty for wildly different degrees of the same technical breach, all under one blanket guideline. That's not a story about Hamilton being targeted. That's a story about a penalty framework that doesn't distinguish between 1/10 over the limit and 5/10 over the limit, and Hamilton just happened to be the highest profile driver caught inside it. Here's the explanation from inside Ferrari itself, because a chef's voice sits at the center of this the way it should. Ferrari has publicly addressed what's been described as a succession of race incidents involving Hamilton this season, framing it not as a driver problem, but as the natural byproduct of a driver pushing at the absolute limit of a competitive car for the first time in his Ferrari career. That's the team's read. More edge means more contact with the rules, not more carelessness. Let's talk about what this file actually costs in consequence, because a stack of investigations only matters if it changes outcomes. The Hungary grid penalty converted a near pole position into a 5th place start, a swing worth real championship points on a weekend where Hamilton finished outside the podium entirely. The Spa penalty and subsequent fine cost time and momentum on a weekend that ended with Hamilton climbing to 2nd in the championship anyway, showing the results are strong enough to absorb these hits. For now. Add it up and you're looking at a season where Hamilton has been demonstrably fast enough to fight at the front, while simultaneously carrying more stewarding weight than nearly anyone else on the grid. So here's where Zandvoort actually fits into this file. And we need to be honest about what we know and don't know as this video goes out. The Dutch Grand Prix weekend is still in progress. Practice has run. The race itself, the moment where 6 of this season's 5 prior incidents have historically originated, hasn't happened yet. We are not going to tell you Zandvoort has already produced a 6th case, because as of this video, it hasn't. What we can tell you is that Zandvoort's own specific characteristics, that banked high-speed final corner feeding directly onto the pit straight, is exactly the kind of technical layout that produced one of this file's most infamous prior entries at this very circuit. If this weekend produces anything resembling a repeat, this file doesn't just get one case longer. It gets a case longer at the one track on the calendar where the pattern already has history. Now the steelman for the system itself, because it deserves the same fairness we're asking of everything else in this file. F1 stewards operate under enormous public scrutiny themselves, with every decision published, dated, and picked apart by millions of fans within hours. A panel that let a 7-time champion slide on technical breaches simply because of his stature would face exactly the kind of bias accusation this video is examining, just aimed in the opposite direction. Consistency sometimes looks like harshness when it's applied to the biggest name on the grid, precisely because that name gets more coverage than every other penalty combined. We're not going to tell you whether this file represents genuine pattern or simple bad luck compounding across a long season, because neither we nor anyone outside those stewards' rooms can prove it either way with certainty. What we can tell you is that 5 investigations in one season, with 4 penalties attached, is a number worth sitting with rather than shrugging off, and it's a legitimate question to ask why that number has grown alongside Hamilton's best form, in years rather than during a struggling one. So here's what actually gets tested this weekend. Not just whether Ferrari's floor upgrade delivers pace on the Zandvoort tarmac, but whether this file stays at 5 cases, or whether the one circuit on the calendar with the most loaded history for Hamilton adds a 6th entry to a season that's already carrying more scrutiny than any other driver on the grid. We've covered several of these incidents individually as they happen throughout the season, and if you want the deeper dive into any single case in this file, those videos sit right alongside this one. The Dutch Grand Prix runs this Sunday, and if anything new lands on Hamilton's file at Zandvoort, we'll be back with exactly what the steward's document says and doesn't say. Like this, if you think this pattern deserves more scrutiny than it's getting, comment which single case in this file you think was the most unfair, and subscribe so you're here the moment Sunday's verdict, if there is one, comes down. Until the next one.